Hi, I'm Dr Emma Pomeroy. I'm lecturer in the evolution of health, diet and disease in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. My research is quite wide-ranging, looking at various aspects of health and both in the present and in the past, looking at how studying people today can tell us about our past, but also how looking at our past can tell us something about health and disease in the present today. I also have a strong interest in Neanderthals, and it's in that part of my research life that I am involved in the Shanidar Cave project. So obviously the new excavations at Shanidar Cave are an interdisciplinary project involving a whole team of people, like most archaeological projects do today. And an important part of that is the collaboration that we have with the General Directorate of Antiquities and in particular the Soran office as well in Iraqi Kurdistan. In addition, we bring together academics from a whole range of institutions. So the project is led by Professor Emeritus Graham Barker at the University of Cambridge and also Professor Chris Hunt at Liverpool John Moores University and Dr Tim Reynolds at Birkbeck in London. We then have a whole range of specialists, including from Professor Tom Hyam's lab at Oxford in terms of the dating. We are very fortunate as well to have a fantastic team from Canterbury Archaeological Trust who come out to the field with us every year and are involved in the excavations too. In terms of the soil micromorphology, for example, that was an important part of this latest paper. We have Professor Charlie French and Dr Lucy Farr at the University of Cambridge working on that too. So it really is sort of a big team all bringing our separate kind of specialist areas of knowledge together to give us a much fuller indication and fuller understanding of what we're finding here at Shanidar Cave. So what we found during excavations at Shanidar Cave that we report on in our article in Antiquity were the remains of a Neanderthal individual. So they're an older individual at the time they died. We think probably in their mid to late 40s. They're an adult. We don't know yet whether they were male or female. And what we found is the skeleton from about the waist upwards. So we've got the whole of the upper body and including the skull. So I think when we first made the discovery of the new Shanidar Cave Neanderthal remains, which we've temporarily labelled Shanidar Z, we realised pretty quickly that this was actually quite an important find. We first identified these new remains as we were cleaning the original trenches that Ralph Selecki dug and removing all the backfill, and just found a few, actually it was metacarpal bones, in that bit of backfill. So then we looked carefully at the trench wall and were able to identify quite substantial Neanderthal remains in the section itself. What we've been doing as part of the Shanidar Cave project is reopening the original excavations that finished in 1960. And so we knew from the plans and the records that this precise spot was exactly where they had removed the original so-called flower burial or Shanidar 4. So for that reason as well, we knew that it was, if not right next to, in very close proximity to that find. So again, for that reason, it was a potentially, we knew there was a lot of potential there, and this could be a really exciting discovery. The importance of Shanidar Cave as a site for the study of Neanderthals really goes back to the original work by Ralph Selecki, which took place between 1951 and 1960. And what he discovered were the remains of 10 Neanderthals. So not all of them were complete, but there were men and women and also young babies too. And these remains have been really central to our understanding of Neanderthals ever since for various reasons. So not only informing us about the morphology of Neanderthals in Southwest Asia, but telling us a lot also about their behaviour. So somewhat controversially, Ralph Selecki argued that some of the Neanderthals were intentionally buried, and particularly that Shanidar 4, the so-called flower burial, had been buried with flowers. Now, this, he argued, was made them really human, made them very much like us, which really went against the stream of how many people saw Neanderthals sort of back in the 1960s and 70s. It's really important as well because other Neanderthal individuals from the site have really interesting characteristics. So Shanidar I famously had suffered quite severe trauma during his lifetime, leading to partial paralysis, probably partial blindness, and the loss of part of one of his arms. And yet he seems to have survived for decades probably with these injuries. And so again, this has fed into debates about Neanderthal compassion and caring for their dead. So I think it's true to say that the remains that have come from Shanidar Cave have really informed a wide range of aspects of the debate about Neanderthal behaviour. So, of course, when you're going back to excavate a site that was first excavated back in sort of the 1950s and up to 1960, there's an awful lot of challenges. So the original trench that Ralph Selecki had dug went down originally to about 14 meters depth in some places, but it had been backfilled over the years. So the Shanidar Cave project aimed to reopen that original trench. So of course there's huge amounts of backfill to remove, which in itself is a challenge. And actually until relatively recently, a couple of decades ago, there were transhuman shepherds actually living in the cave periodically. So it was full of sort of all their rubbish and goat poo and things like this. So all lots of lovely things that we had to get back out. Now, of course, with very sort of deep excavation like this as well, the old sort of sections, the walls of the excavation, have perhaps become unstable. So we have to be very careful when we re-expose them that they're not posing any threat to anyone working in the trench. And of course, being in a cave and being in a tectonically active area, things have shifted in the meantime. And a good example of that is actually there was on the surface, we can see in some of Ralph Selecki's original photos, there was a huge rock, probably the size of a van, sitting just on the edge of the trench. And actually in the intervening years, that had fallen into the trench itself. So not only has that created damage, but it's created instability, and also then challenges of sort of removing some of these big rocks and boulders and things and making things safe. So we're lucky that we have a fantastic team who are very good at making sure the shoring's in place and that we are working in safe conditions. Another one of the challenges is actually just matching up exactly the trench itself, but also some of the things that Selecki himself found with the trench today. There are challenges like, for example, we don't know exactly where his datum is or was. So although we've got really detailed records of what he found and what depths, actually trying to match that up exactly is not as straightforward as you might hope. So yeah, lots of challenges in going back to that site. So in terms of the debate about Neanderthals being not so different from modern humans in their behaviour, Shanidar and the recent results in particular are going to have a really important contribution to make to some of these discussions. And I think it's of course worth remembering that actually some of these discussions about sort of the modernity, if you like, of Neanderthal behaviour come back to some of those original findings from the 1960s. So, for example, Ralph Selecki's argument that the Shanidar IV individual was buried with flowers. This was extremely controversial and still is, but he really argued for a much more human kind of Neanderthal. And this point of view has become more common in recent years, and we're accumulating more and more evidence. But one of the things that we can perhaps hope to do with the remains that we report on in our antiquity paper is to try and revisit some of these debates and some of these questions and actually shed some new light on exactly what Neanderthal mortuary behaviour was like, so what they did with their dead, but also whether we can identify what we might call a truly funerary component, so a component to that behaviour that's imbued with symbolic meaning. And of course, when Selecki did these original excavations back in 1960, he sampled for pollen, he did what he could at the time. But of course, technology today and archaeological science has moved on a great deal. So we can kind of bring the whole range of archaeological scientific techniques to bear on some of this new evidence. So we can look, for example, as we report in the paper, for evidence of whether there is a cut, so whether a pit or a depression was cut into the sediments to place the body. We can look at the nature of the soil around the body. We can look again for evidence of plants and perhaps try and understand where any plants might have come from, but contribute to those older debates about the extent to which the pollen that was found with Shanidar 4 was actually ancient or could have been modern contamination. I think there's some really interesting questions in particular relating to the new finds, that what we have there is a concentration of individuals. So that original Shanidar 4 discovery included the remains of 3 other Neanderthals, actually, Shanidar 6, 8 and 9. And this cluster of individuals within a very small kind of metre by half metre block is really quite remarkable. So by having new remains that we can directly associate with this, gives us a new opportunity to look at the nature of that behaviour. So were they going back to that very same spot? It's a big cave, and yet we've got this concentration of Neanderthals in a really tiny area. So if so, why were they doing that? And how were they doing that? Is there evidence of markers, for example? And these are all questions that we can sort of readdress today with the modern evidence and with the new discoveries that we have. So I think people are drawn to Neanderthals because they represent something very similar to us and yet very different. So they're that fascinating mixture, I think, of the familiar but yet the exotic and the unfamiliar. There's also a very deep history, if you like, of discussion about Neanderthals. So they're the first hominin that was actually recognized as being a human relative. And although we can see sort of aspects of ourself in them, like the large brains, things like aspects of the facial morphology, for example, are quite different. So we have this interesting mix of something like us and yet not like us. And I think that's only intensified with the evidence of things like interbreeding from the genetic evidence. It really makes us then question, okay, so how similar were we? How different were we? What's the nature of these interactions? And ultimately, how does it end up that here we are today, many of us carrying a bit of Neanderthal DNA, but actually the Neanderthals aren't here, as are not other species, the Denisovans, for example. So yeah, I think that's why they sort of always capture our imagination. They're these close cousins that are kind of enigmatic, that we know so little about, relatively speaking, and yet through sort of continuing excavations, we're finding out more and more and discovering lots of new information and challenging a lot of those ideas that we originally held. So we chose to publish our results in Antiquity for several reasons. It's obviously a very well-known, well-established, well-respected archaeological journal that has a very wide readership. And actually, we really wanted these results to reach people not only sort of interested in specifically Neanderthals, but a wider archaeological audience. There were also other considerations. The fact that actually we were able to include a relatively large number of illustrations, because we felt, particularly with this find, it was important to illustrate it quite richly, and that's something that Antiquity gives us the opportunity to do. And then, of course, the option for open access is important, because we're really keen that as many people as possible can access the original research and see these images. So those sort of multiple considerations came into our choice of journal. In terms of the impact, we knew it was an exciting finding, and obviously we were very excited about it, but maybe we're biased as being part of the project, but we had a fantastic response. The story was picked up by news agencies all over the world, and myself and then the director of the project, Graham Barker, are involved in doing interviews in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, and beyond that via answering questions via email for various outlets. So yeah, it got a lot of attention, and it was really, really wonderful to see this sort of interest in new discoveries and in new archaeological science. So yes, so we do have plans to go back to Shanidar for further excavation. We've actually just started a new grant from the John Templeton Foundation, and that's going to enable us to go back for 3 more field seasons, but it's also going to help us do a lot of the associated lab work. So what we reported on in our Antiquity article was really the discovery of the new Neanderthal remains and some of the other analyses alongside it. There's actually a huge amount of work still to do. We've got many more samples to analyse. We've got the conservation and the reconstruction of the remains themselves to do. And so this grant is going to enable us actually to do that work. So we're very excited to be able to now move ahead and on to the next stage of analysis.